Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Lenny.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten and I'm joined by Chad Gross. Greetings.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing great. Looking forward to a wonderful interview today with our guest, Lenny Esposito. We've been following Lenny for a while, haven't we?
Oh, yeah. I've used Lenny's work for years for reference and super helpful, and posted some of his articles and blog posts on Truth Bomb, actually. I also want to ask him if he's related to the famous hockey player Phil Esposito.
Well, you'll have that chance. I know Lenny's work with Come Reason Ministries, comereason.org. That's where you can find his stuff. He had a podcast, well, he still does. Has been going strong for a long time. Come Let Us Reason Together is his podcast. You can find it on all the cool kids players. But podcast.comereason.org is where you can find that. And, you know, when I was back doing graphic design and getting into apologetics, you know, just listen to audio all day. And Lenny's was a daily listen, you know, just listen to all his stuff. So he's been doing apologetics on the web since it was like text-based, you know what I mean? Before there was video or pictures or animated GIFs, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
We'll be talking to him today, a little bit more about him. He's the president and founder of Come Reason Ministries. He's the author at comereason.org. He taught apologetics and Christian worldview for 20 years, or more than 20 years, and has authored hundreds of articles dealing with intellectually strenuous topics such as the existence of God, theology, philosophy, social issues, and Bible difficulties. So again, you can find his podcast at podcast.comereason.org. Check out his stuff at comereason.org for all his great articles and resources. We're looking forward to speaking with him today.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Lenny Esposito, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. I'm excited to be back, excited to talk with you again after, like we said, so many years now, but excited that Apologetics 315 is still ongoing and making a difference, because it's important, especially today. It becomes more and more important in all that we see and all that we do, that there is a thoughtful voice out there, as many voices actually as we can get. So that's a big plus.
Well, I appreciate that, and also the work you've done since the dawn of the internet. you were there with Al Gore when it started, weren't you?
Almost.
Wow.
So let me. Matter of fact, it's 2021. I launched an apologetics website in 1996, and so this is our 25th anniversary of me being online doing Christian apologetics. Now, back then, you know, the internet was still in what we called three-cornered shorts. It was what I call the gray page days of Netscape 2.0. And I wanted to build a website, and I wanted it to be meaningful and have interactive discussion. I looked to the radio. I looked at like the Bible Answer Man and what Walter Martin was doing, and I thought that was cool. Can I do something like that online? Yeah. So I put up a website called Come Let Us Reason Together. But you can't put up a website without content. Where am I going to find the content? Well, back then, there weren't chat rooms and social media and things like that. So what I had to do is I had to go to a BBS, a bulletin board system, which you had a local dial-up, right? You had a local number, and it was all text-based. And I found in one of these local BBSs an atheist and a Christian going back and forth. So I grabbed their conversation, and I started answering the points of the atheist point by point, called it Answering an Atheist, and posted it. And then we had another little exchange, and then someone wrote in and asked another question, and someone wrote in and asked another question. And that's how the online ministry started. So it started as a website way back in the 90s. We incorporated in 1999 as a 501c3 ministry, did podcasts starting in 2006. So yeah, it's been some time. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
I'm feeling a little dated when you say way back in the 90s.
Yeah, well, everything. I mean, I remember when this is what I tell the kids. I say, you don't understand what it was like. You would get up in the morning, you turn on your computer, and you press check email, and then you'd go take a shower, And then you'd come back to see if you had any, because you were excited, actually, if you got an email or not. 14.4 modems, right? 28.8 modems. It was, yeah. And if there came a new Internet Explorer browser or something like that, you left the computer on all night because it was tying up the phone line. And hopefully by morning, the download would have been finished. So that was what was going on back then.
Yeah, so awesome.
Those were the days. Well, hey, before we get into the apologetic content, I have to ask you this. I've always wondered this. You probably asked this like 3,000 times. Are you related to Phil Esposito of the Boston Bruins? Phil
or Tony? Yeah. Tony just passed away last week. But no, I don't believe so. The name Esposito is Italian, but it comes from Naples. And it was what they would call the orphans, I guess, in the early Renaissance, the 1500s, 1400s, something like that. It means the sent out ones, the put out ones. And so that's just kind of the surname that picked up. So I don't believe I'm related to them, but it's all my kids love hockey. I had a son who played hockey all through high school and everything like that. It was great because, you saw that name on the back of the hockey jersey, and it was a lot of fun. So, and none of the announcers ever blew the pronunciation. They always got it.
If you're a hockey announcer and you get Esposito wrong, you're out.
Yeah, you got a problem. So it was fun, but no, unfortunately not.
Okay. I was just curious.
Speaking of apologetics on the internet, we're talking about what wasn't out there back in the day. I mean, I was saying to Chad earlier that your podcast was, back when there was not a whole pile of apologetics podcasts, say 10 years ago, and yours was like in my top list, and I would listen to that constantly.
Oh, yes.
And so now it's like, wow, it's hard to narrow things down. There's a lot of resources. I'm curious if you think that there might be certain resources that are still lacking, that, need a gap that maybe needs to be filled.
Well, there's a lot of apologetics out there. Of course, everything's shifting to video now. Mm-hmm. Usually they have an audio counterpart to it, but YouTube is, and I don't know if you're in ministry, one of the things that you really need to understand is Google is the world's largest search engine. That's where everybody goes for the first query. Number 2 is YouTube, actually, because many people will go to YouTube and say, how do I fix a carburetor? Or is God real? And they actually want the visual as much as the audio. Yeah. And now, for me, it doesn't. I'd actually rather have the audio because I can walk around while I'm doing something. And most of the time, people do that. They'll turn it on, let it stream, and they'll walk around. But video is really dominant. So if you're starting a ministry or being in a ministry, video is really key right now. However, a lot of apologetics falls into usually one of two camps. Either it's kind of standard reasons for God, problem of evil, the standard objections that you hear, and you get folks working through those in different ways. And then you get a lot of response apologetics, countering a meme, countering the latest thing that's happening, this and that. What I don't see, and what I've been really starting to work into a lot more, is what we would call cultural apologetics, which is how do we approach our modern society, our modern civilization, almost in a missionary mindset, where we can't assume that they would be able to name 3 of the 10 commandments. They would be able to name, you ask them who are the apostles, and they'll say, well, there's John, there's Paul, George and Ringo, maybe. But, there is no context anymore that becomes a common referent, as there would have been even up to the 70s in Francis Schaeffer's day. We're losing that discussion, and people have a misnomer about what Christianity is, about how it's understood, things like that. So I think that there's a void there in engaging how to show Christianity as winsome and attractive on its own merits, not necessarily simply reacting to an objection from somebody else, but saying, we grew up in a Christian worldview. There was even though our culture is fleeing the Christian underlying foundation, there's still a lot of assumptions of Christianity. And so how do we leverage those to show really how necessary Christianity is? You're seeing this in even atheist writings, right? Tom Holland in Dominion, for example, showing how Christianity lays the bedrock and the foundation of our society in the West. So how can we use that effectively? And I don't see a whole lot of folks doing that. I am on the radio once a month with the apologetics.com guys, and that's what we engage in a lot. I'm doing stuff with popular media as well. And all of that, I think, helps contribute to an engagement and to a discussion that leads you in a different place than simply, believe the Bible as your starting point.
Mm-hmm. We've done a little bit of talking about cultural apologetics with a couple of our guests. And so let's unpack that just a bit. And
sure.
What would you, if someone said, well, how would you define cultural apologetics, or what does that look like? What would be your response? And maybe along with that, as I like to bundle my questions, what is cultural apologetics not, if you will?
Okay. Well, and Paul Gould wrote a book about this as well. But cultural apologetics is taking the underlying values and assumptions that people have as worthy in the culture. What are those values and assumptions? All men are created equal is an assumption. It's a value that we hold. It's a moral proposition, actually. Well, where does that come from? How do we understand that? See, I'm not starting from the Bible. I'm saying you and I hold something in common in our culture. We both believe that all men are created, and not every culture does. Matter of fact, throughout most of history, most humanity did not hold that to be true, right? You had the Greeks and the barbarians. You have the Jews and the Gentiles. You have the infidels versus the faithful. So you see this dichotomy. There's always the us and the everybody else. We don't hold that anymore. What changed? What made this idea that all men are created equal ubiquitous in our society? So much so that if you were to claim something different, that would be considered anathema. And that's a Christian idea, as just one example. So that's Christianity laying the foundation. And so you can start teasing out those kinds of things. So when I say cultural apologetics, it's showing that the best answers to the values that we hold in a society, even in a secular society, still rest upon a biblical framework, a Christian worldview, a Christian foundation. What cultural apologetics is not is simply, like I say, answering a meme. Yeah. Just because something is out there in culture doesn't mean that the apologetics is cultural. Now, we may do that as part and parcel of our apologetic. I'm not against that. I think those are important as well, because the internet is such that, any Google search makes you an instant scholar, right? You just, whatever the guy said, you take the top result of the counteracting statement and you paste it, and now you're done. So those things need to be out there, but that's not the same thing as engaging in the common shared values and understandings of society. And it's getting harder because there's fewer and fewer things that people share in common. And I'm not talking about merely Christians and non-Christians. I'm talking about in all societies. So, for example, in the 1980s, 1990s, your biggest source, your primary source of hearing new music was via the radio. I mean, you would listen to radio. And there were popular bands, some of whom you liked, some of whom you didn't. But even if you didn't like the band, you knew who they were, you knew what songs they sung because they were on the radio and you heard them all the time. With the advent of iPod and later Spotify, you became your own DJ, right? Everything became narrowed into just what you wanted to hear. So now we don't even have shared cultural reference anymore. It's been splintered into all of these different factions, and some people in this area of the country will like this, and some people even down to this high school, this band will take off in this area, and so we don't have a shared common referent anymore. So it's becoming difficult to do that. The only place I really see that we do have, I mean, people don't read, we can't really, point to a whole lot of books, The only place I really see that we have a shared common foundation is through film. Film is a very powerful medium, and that's something that we all have to see because it's such a big production. My fourth son is named Lucas. I named him Lucas. And I tell him, I did that so I could walk up to you and say, Luke, I am your father. You know,
Nice.
Now, see, I don't have to explain that reference.
Yeah.
Everybody gets it. Okay, we have something shared there. So film becomes a really important piece of how we can use the values that are shown through Hollywood, maybe to launch into our apologetic. And I wrote a chapter in a book with Sean McDowell a few years ago called "A New Generation of Apologetics," and it was using Hollywood blockbusters to share your faith. That was the chapter, and I start off with the reference to Star Wars and how it really shook me. I mean, I remember as a little kid. I don't know if you guys remember this, seeing when you sat in the theater, nothing like this had ever happened before. You see the ship fly overhead and he's shooting backwards, and then the battle cruiser comes and you're sitting there going, this thing goes on forever. This ship never stops. And you'd never seen that in Hollywood before. And right away I was hooked. And obviously Star Wars touched something because we see it so many years later with so many permeations, but everybody knows it and everybody still watches it. So that's what I see as a cultural apologetic, where we can reach out to those common experiences and leverage them to talk about underlying values, underlying beliefs, and then start to say, well, wait a minute, how do those beliefs make sense?
So if I'm understanding it correctly, it's almost as if you're saying, you seem to value things like justice, love, mercy, kindness, whatever it might be. And then you point back to the fact that those things are actually grounded in the Christian worldview.
That's right.
That they make the most sense on the Christian worldview.
Not merely they make the most sense, but the world was different until then. That those values only came about because Christianity became such a dominant shaper of our culture through the medieval period. And we can see this by all we have to do is look at any society across human history that was non-Christian, that wasn't exposed to it. You look at the Far East, you look at the Mayans and the Aztecs and how they treated their societies. You even Islam and its history throughout all of the Romans and the Greeks. One of the things that Tom Holland said in his book was, he was always enamored by this great gilded age of Rome and things like that. And as a historian, when he really started studying them, he was shocked to find out how barbarous and how non-egalitarian they actually were, in the sense that they were dominant. If you didn't serve Rome, then you were worthy of being subjugated. There's a reason why 70% of that population was enslaved. It was just what they understood the world to be. Aristotle in his Ethics starts off a book on ethics, and he starts off saying some people are just meant to be slaves. They're just born to that.
Yes.
And so you go, wow, how different Christianity really is, how opposite of the world it really is. Of course, Tom Gilson takes this and runs with it a step further in his book, Too Good to Be True, where he says that you can't even make up the story of Jesus if you really had the mindset of a first century inhabitant, because it just bucks everything that society knew. But we stand on another side of that, and people don't realize. It's almost, the fish that doesn't realize it's wet. No matter how avowed and secularist you are, you just don't realize how much of Christianity you sit upon in order to create your moral dictums. So.
I wonder, Lenny, what you think about how you transition, or is there a transition between making that connection and then pointing to the truth of Christianity? Because I can imagine someone saying, oh, yeah, I can see how that cultural shift happened and accept it. But how do you make the next step to, well, this is actually the true view?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways you can do about it. And you really have to understand where folks are coming from. Again, one of the reasons why I like to use film is because it's not a you're wrong, I'm right, or I'm wrong, you're right. We get to share our feelings and our discussions with that third person who's on the screen. Film is powerful because we relate to the central characters, right? So when we see Peter Parker get bit by a radioactive spider, I don't know about you, but every time you see a spider, don't you secretly want to just, maybe if he bites me, maybe. No. If I'm down in San Onofre by the nuclear power plant, then it's possible. But
right.
When you see Peter Parker and you see him in the very first Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, take his power and use it to score $3,000 in order to buy a car, right? Mm-hmm. You're going like, no, that's not right. That's not right. You know, and we know that whole dictum, with great power comes great responsibility. And you ask your friend that you're watching that, hey, do you agree with that? Yeah, I agree with that. You know that with great power comes great responsibility. You know that's a paraphrase of something that Jesus said, to whom much is given, much is required. That's where that idea comes from. Why is it wrong for Peter Parker to use his abilities to serve himself? Why don't we want him to be a Hancock, for example? Right? Remember the Will Smith movie Hancock?
Oh, yeah.
He's just drinking, he'll just do whatever and destroying everything. We don't want that. We say he's wrong in doing that. Says who? You know, that doesn't make any sense to me. But we all accept it. So why? What is the moral value? Where is the morality coming from that saying Peter Parker should not merely simply use it to not benefit himself, but actually it works to his detriment? I mean, he starts missing classes. He has to work 2 jobs. You know, he should be able to make a lot of money on this stuff, but we don't want that. We want a Spider-Man who's virtuous. Well, where do you get that from? Well, Christianity teaches that the greatest shall be the least. That's only a Christian teaching. That is found in no other faith in the world. That if you want to be the leader of all, you're going to be washing feet. Don't you, if that's the value, then don't you want the people with most power to be following that? And if Christianity is teaching the values that you want the most powerful people to follow, then doesn't it also make sense that maybe you and I should be able to follow it? Isn't it worth at least exploring a worldview, a value system, a teaching that promotes humility, that promotes virtue for its own sake, that promotes servant living? Shouldn't we explore that a little bit more, be a little bit more open-minded? Now we've moved away from the do's and the don'ts. We're talking about the underlying force of love, because that's really what you define love as, is selflessness, right? Mm-hmm. Love is selflessness. And now we can have a real discussion and draw people in by the beauty of Christianity as opposed to the regiment and the dictates of Christianity.
Yeah, I love that. I love that scene in the Maguire Spider-Man when the Green Goblin takes him on top of the building, and he's basically saying, you know, the one thing people love more than a hero is to watch him fall. And he says, you know, sooner or later they'll turn on you. Like, why are you doing this? And he simply says, because it's right.
Yes, exactly.
You know, because it's right. That's his answer. Like, it really doesn't matter how they treat me or how they respond to me. I'm going to do it because it's right. And that just illustrates the point you're making.
Yeah. So, and there's so much, and superhero films specifically. Now, I was always a geek as a kid. I was always, you know, loved Batman. Ever since the Adam West version came out, I always loved all of that.
Wham! Pow!
Yeah. Holy hand grenades, Batman. But there's something obviously that strikes a chord, given the entire Marvel universe and the explosion that the whole Avengers franchise created. There's obviously some longing there that's deep-seated within our culture that needs to be fulfilled. And that's wonderful, because now you can start coaxing out all of these ideas. The whole concept of the superhero, the Superman, who should be, you know, he would be, right? What does Marlon Brando say? You know, will he be his mom worries and when they're sending him off in the rocket. Is he going to be subjugated on Earth? And Marlon Brando, no, he'll be a god there. And he could have been, right? And so in Man of Steel, when General Zod comes in, that's what Zod sees. Hey, yes, we have such a power over these weakling mortals that it makes more sense for us to rule and them to serve us. Right. And he doesn't see it that way, right? Kal-El says, no. I grew up with Midwestern values, and I'm going to take being prodded and made fun of as Clark Kent just because it's the right thing to do to serve others. Mm-hmm. And again, where does that come from? I point even there's controversy over the third Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie. There's some folks who don't like the symbiote episode.
Right. They kind of, Sony forced Raimi to kind of shoehorn in Venom.
Yeah.
And it wasn't originally planned. And so, yeah, some people.
Well, and some guys call it the emo Spider-Man because he has the black liner on his eyes and things like that. But actually, I kind of like it. And here's why, because I think it's a wonderful analogy of sin. So what does the symbiote do? First, and if the comics came first and it parallels some of course. At first, it just kind of enhances what you already have, right? You're in control of it, but it makes you a little bit stronger, a little bit more alive, a little bit, I feel better. But eventually, you're all black all the time, and it starts to change you, and it changes your emotion, and it changes your demeanor, and it starts to have a hunger that you have to continually feed. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful parallel to what sin does in a person's life. So I can use that and say, and Peter Parker has to fight even harder to get rid of the symbiote as he lets it grow. The earlier he gets rid of it, the better. And just so happens in both scenes, when the symbiote flees from him, what's the thing that makes that chases away the symbiote? It's noise in general, but what is it specifically? Church bells. It's church bells. And it's like, this is a wonderful analogy that I can use. And when people don't understand what sin is, this is what sin is. And so again, I don't have to say, this is you and your sin. I can say, this is him and his sin. Now, is there anything in your life that parallels that? And all of a sudden, I'm not accusing them, but it gives them something to think about. And it puts it in the proper context to where I say, maybe you need to start running to the church bells.
Yeah, and the theme in that film of forgiveness too is so powerful.
Right.
When Peter forgives Flint Marko for shooting his uncle, right? And you can see when he says that he forgives him, you can see the countenance, like he takes a breath, like it's such a load that he's gotten rid of, and so those two things coupled together, it's really powerful.
Yeah. So it's that kind of stuff all the time. And you can use it you can even use it in technical aspects. So for example, I've used Forrest Gump as a way of helping people understand why the Gospels are reliable. I mean,
I got to hear this.
Okay. Well, it's now think about Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump was filmed in the 1990s, came out in the mid 1990s. But it deals with many of the events in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, late 50s through the 70s. So it touches on, the football team that wins the right. Forrest is one of the folks who meets the President Kennedy. It right. touches on the Vietnam War. It works on the jogging craze and the happy face and all of these things that are real cultural touchstones. So it's about 30 years prior to the events that it portrays. I mean, the events that are portrayed about 30 years prior to when the film's coming out. And people can remember that. The Gospels were written talking about events that were 30 years prior to when they were actually were put down on parchment. So you from the, say, 60s to 95, approximately, maybe 59, depending on which scholars you're looking at. But the Gospels were written from the 60s to the 90s, but they're talking about events that are happening in the 30 CE. Okay, so this is just about the same time span. and I say, now imagine this. Take somebody like Paul or anybody who's been living in that era. They read these Gospels and they're supposed to convert to Christianity. Well, imagine a high-ranking member of the Taliban who watches Forrest Gump and says, oh, because Forrest Gump it's obviously history because there's these ping pong tournaments and this jogging thing and this Vietnam War thing at the Washington Memorial. And I know those happen. So obviously I have to believe all of Forrest Gump. And I'm going to renounce my status within the Taliban. I'm going to become a Baptist minister, change my name to Buzz Summers or something like that. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it, that those fables of the Forrest Gump saga would hold that much sway to make those people change, because people were around it, they remember it. Well, that's what you're saying when you're saying that Christianity forged these stories and that the Jews, who were notoriously monotheistic, would have just abandoned their faith, and then the Romans would have just abandoned their faith, and Paul, who was a high-ranking member within the Sanhedrin, would just abandon his faith. I mean, really, it doesn't make any sense, because people think for some reason that just because it's way back then that people didn't think at all back then. They just believed whatever was put in front of them. And
right.
it's like believing Forrest Gump would convert a Taliban leader into, a Baptist missionary. It just, it really doesn't make sense. So we can use these kind of examples and tease things out all the time.
Wait, Lenny. So are you telling me that Forrest Gump's not historical then? Is that what you're
there were some liberties that the filmmaker took, yeah.
There were some
couple of
liberties.
times.
A couple. Just a few.
Yeah.
Just a few. Yeah.
I wonder what your thoughts are on the trend towards like anti-heroes, or you're seeing a lot more. It used to be like Superman was like, had all the kinds of integrity, and the heroes were basically, integrity was one of the core features, but now you're seeing a trend towards, oh, this is a flawed hero. This hero has demons, that kind of a thing. Does that give us any clues as far as where culture is, or does that offer any sort of touch points or talking points for evangelism?
That's a wonderful question. And I've written an article on this on my blog, The Rise of the Anti-Hero, where I point to, you got Walter White, right? You got Dexter, even the Angelina Jolie Maleficent.
Yeah.
Where
Frank Castle.
They make excuses kind of for why she's evil, kind of thing. Yes, it does. What it shows is that our culture is shifting away from that Christian foundation. We are moving from what would be known as a guilt-innocence culture. And a guilt-innocence culture is simply one where the individual bears the burden of his responsibility for his actions. You're either guilty or you're innocent, and you must be proven guilty to be considered guilty. We're moving back to the human standard, which is an honor-shame culture. And again, this is replete throughout society. In Japan, for example, the whole idea, if you've brought shame onto the family name, you had to do something for it, right? And the whole idea of chopping off a finger or something like that was made popular in films, or even in Islam, where if a woman is raped, if a young girl is raped, they may say that she has brought shame onto her family. Or if she marries outside the Islamic faith, she has brought shame onto her family, and they do honor killings, or they'll throw acid in her face, or all of this. So this honor shame culture is not necessarily dealing with objective moral standards. It's dealing with whether the communal understanding of the individual's actions is considered honorable and worthy for whatever goals the community has, or are they considered shameful? And if they're considered shameful, then not only is the person who maybe be doing the actions guilty, but the shame is also carried on by individuals who either support them, help them, cheer them on, right? Cancel culture is what we call it today, but that's what we see more. The anti-hero is that. The anti-hero is, it's okay, I can be a Dexter because I'm only killing other killers, even though he takes glee in it. I'm only killing other killers. So that makes it okay. But notice, even in the rise of the anti-hero, there's still some fundamental assumptions that one must hold. Nobody is totally depraved, I should say. Deadpool ultimately goes after worse people than himself. Dexter ultimately goes after you have to be lower because the audience won't buy it if you're just an assassin who, hits a mid-level accountant in his house, wipes out his family, and then walks away, and that's the end of the film. They won't buy that. They still want some kind of justice. So there's still, even in the rise of the anti-hero, an idea that there should be some kind of justice performed. But what concerns me is in eras past, even that would have been too much. You can't make this person the hero. But it's a long-going experiment. I mean, art, especially paint and things like that, has for a long time abandoned the idea that its primary purpose was to elevate the human condition and elevate human understanding, into now its primary purpose is to simply shock. And usually they shock by doing things that are grotesque or profane or tasteless. So you think Andres Sigarios, right? The piss Christ, and he sunk a crucifix in a bottle of urine. That's art. No, that's not art. That doesn't tell anybody anything. All that does is shock for the sake of shock value. So we've seen this degradation in some of the other arts, and it's not surprising now that as we move into an honor-shame culture, that we will start to see more and more of the anti-heroes or the relative heroes rise. Some people say, well, it's interesting because he can be flawed. Well, a flawed hero is one thing, but a hero who purposely does wrong and uses his immorality without any kind of objection, that's a whole other story. And that's what we're starting to promote. So it's a very morally pragmatic approach, and moral pragmatism is always problematic.
So, Lenny, did you watch Falcon and Winter Soldier?
Yes.
Okay, I found it. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this because I've talked to a number of people about this. I found it fascinating, and I'm going to give a spoiler if you haven't watched it by now. Sorry, listeners. If so, turn it off and then turn it back on in a few minutes. But
that never works.
When Sam finally becomes Cap, right? Okay, which shouldn't be a shock by now. I mean, there's T-shirts and toys and everything of him now as Captain America, right? And he gives the speech to, you probably know where I'm going with this, to the to the politicians. Mm-hmm. And he says to stop calling, in so many words, he basically says, stop calling the terrorists. That's essentially what he tells them. He's essentially, but I mean, literally, the flag smashers were killing people in the name of their political views. I mean, they were literally the definition of terrorists. But here he is saying, stop these labels, stop calling them that. So when Brian brings up, Superman and Superman was like
the Blue Boy Scout.
Yeah. In most of the comics and things, I mean, even Batman really, like even in like the Michael Keaton version and such, there was this clear line between good and evil, right and wrong. And I saw that. I felt like I saw that blurred a little bit in that scene.
Well, I agree. And that's part of that is a acquiescence to modern culture's idea of drawing any kind of distinctions at all. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to watch modern society take a Christian principle, like, again, you don't judge any person by their appearance, or don't simply label people, those kinds of things, and then turn around and beat us with our own yardstick. Because it's not don't judge anybody for anything, right?
Sure.
Somebody once said that the most memorized line in the Bible is not John 3:16. It's Matthew 7:1. Do not be judged lest you are judged. Don't judge others unless you're willing to be judged by the same rule. But that's completely out of context, because further down, Jesus says, you will know them by their fruit. you can be a fruit inspector. And Paul tells the Corinthian church, look, if somebody's being immoral, you got to call them on the carpet. You got to talk to them, and you talk to them with church leadership. And if they still won't listen, you kick them out of the church. There has to be consequences for poor actions, for immoral actions. And again, we're losing that for the sake of individualism. Well, I think our society has become hyper individualized. We've lost the idea. And the problem with hyper individuality is you can have no community by definition. When everybody is their own island, then there is no community. And that's where we start paying that price. So by saying there's no such thing as a terrorist, yes, there is, because there's a such thing as terrorism. And if you're going to decry that, you have to decry that consistently. You have to say the ends doesn't justify the means. Otherwise, why say don't cheat on a test? Right? We have a whole bunch of very wealthy parents getting ready to go to jail because they forged their kids' applications. They went through a process, had somebody else take the SATs for them. And everybody's up in arms about that. They don't mind calling them cheaters. But if you blow somebody up, you can't be called a terrorist?
Yeah.
How is that consistent? How are you even consistent with your own worldview? One of the things that I do is I've taken kids on these apologetics mission trips. So we go to Berkeley, and I've been to Dearborn, Michigan, places like that, Salt Lake City. And when I was talking to a person at Berkeley about this kind of thing, and we ask these kinds of questions, we say, do you believe in God or a higher power? No, of course not. Okay. Do you believe in there's such a thing as an absolute right or wrong? No, I think right or wrong is really depends on the individual's understanding of, okay. And then I ask a question like, well, can you tell me one problem that's plaguing all of humanity? Now, everybody at Berkeley has an answer to that question. It doesn't matter what the answer is, right? It's global warming. It's the subjugation of women. Anything that you can imagine, there's an answer for it. And I usually follow that up by saying, how can this be a problem for all humanity if there's no such thing as an absolute right and wrong for all of humanity? And that gets them to thinking. You see, the problem is you're taking two positions, but they're contradicting one another. And now we have to figure out how to deal with that. And so, again, it's a way to get people thinking. People hold contrary views all the time. They just don't realize it until you point it out to them.
That's good.
Well, Lenny, I want to stay on the same track, but shift gears a bit. And
sure,
you've let us know about a project you're working on, and it's a book of cultural apologetics, very much along the same line of what we were talking about here. It's entitled Secret Identity, The Power of Superhero Films and Sharing Your Faith. So can you talk a little bit about what this project looks like and what's on the horizon?
Well, yeah, so it's very much kind of what we've been talking about already, using these kinds of examples in order to engage folks, friends and family, and others in discussion where they may not otherwise want to discuss issues of faith. Again, you can, I know if I were to ever ask any of my non-believing friends to come see God's Not Dead, they'll be like, yeah, not until I'm dead. It just wouldn't happen. But if you say, hey, let's go see, Winter Soldier, and I'll buy you a cup of coffee afterwards, we could talk about the film. Oh, that's great. Or the new, whatever the next new film would be to come out. And so how do I use those as springboards to talk about things like the existence of God, the problem of evil, all of these kind of traditional apologetics questions that we can get people to start to think on? And again, the idea is not to have a sprint, not to have just simply an answer to someone's objection, but to really engage them and have a discussion where they start thinking about these things in a longer way. So I've kind of broken it up into 10 aspects dealing with each of these issues. Why do we need to do this at all? How the culture has changed, which is a little bit how we began our discussion. And then, does God exist? How do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? All of these kinds of things, and we can start looking at different aspects of film, and specifically, there's a lot, again, you can mine in superhero movies to talk about that. And so I think one of my chapter titles is Getting Beyond I Am Groot, which is what I think a lot of Christians feel like when they're trying to share their faith. That's all they can say, right? Is I am Groot.
Yeah.
Or I tell people a lot of Christians feel like the Tom Holland Spider-Man. If you saw, I think it was Spider-Man Homecoming, right? Where he goes off and, okay, I got the suit. I want to do some good. And what is he doing? He's going out there and he's trying to save someone who's stealing a bicycle, but it's actually some guy's no, I'm not stealing a bicycle. It's my bicycle. Hey, what are you doing with my car? And it's like 2 days. He's sitting there going, I have this power and I know I'm supposed to be doing good and everything I try fails, right? And he keeps texting Tony Stark, please help me. What am I supposed to do? So I feel like a lot of Christians feel that way. So maybe this will help you move the ball a little bit forward and not make those kinds of mistakes, so to speak. So
I wonder if you answer the question in the book, if God exists, why did he allow The Last Jedi?
Yeah. No, I haven't actually approached that one, but that's a really good question. That's definitely a theodicy to deal with. Yeah, there's so much. I mean, George Lucas, of course, was a big fan of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
So Lucas followed Campbell and he incorporated some of Campbell's hero myth ideas in the original Star Wars trilogy. That's where that came from. But Campbell if you read Joseph Campbell, he reminds me a lot of the Jesus mythers of today. He takes the most broad focused view on these guys and he never digs into the details. And so when you actually start to compare what each myth actually teaches, it's far different than what it seems to be. Campbell's very zeitgeisty. If you've ever seen the Zeitgeist film where it claims that Mithra and Dionysus and all this silly stuff. And anytime you actually look at the source material, you go, this isn't what it teaches at all. But at least Lucas had that. At least he had some kind of, again, a Christian kind of framework that tells the story of what a hero is and what it should be. Mm-hmm. And then they just went off the rails. On the last couple. I mean, I went, wow, you've really lost the idea of a hero. And it kind of shows why The Last Jedi became problematic. Sacred books. Oh, we don't need them. Burn them. We got copies anyway. What are you talking about? Isn't there anything that's valuable from the past that we can learn from?
I suppose the failure of the movie kind of proves the point that people don't want you to mess with the formula, so to speak. You know, they don't want you to deviate from what the true hero looks like, and they don't want you to subvert their expectations. They're going there for that sort of template or a paradigm, you know?
Well, yeah, it's very much Chesterton, right? Chesterton says that children need to learn about dragons, not because they need to believe that dragons exist, but they need to believe that there's a St. George who can slay the dragon. And that's one of the aspects that the superhero role plays in our society, that ultimately, and again, this is Christian idealism, that ultimately there will be a judge when all evil is vanquished, where evil individuals get their true comeuppance, where what will be left is what is supposed to be, not what is. And so we all have inner sense, and God has placed this within our heart for an inner need for justice to be delivered. We may not truly understand what justice is. Everybody's maybe a little fuzzy on some of that, but we can work that through. But there is definitely always a need for justice. And when that's not met, you're left unfulfilled. And I think so we could use The Last Jedi as a witnessing tool, but almost as a counterexample. And I think that's a great way to approach it.
Yeah, I am really holding back here. Brian probably knows I am, because I grew up loving the original trilogy. I didn't love the prequels. They were disappointing, but I didn't hate them. I thought The Force Awakens was a good step in the right direction. Even though I thought Kylo Ren was a laughable, silly villain. But man, Last Jedi just killed all interest I had in Star Wars. It's amazing. I've had like 4 different people, Brian being one of them, be like, Chad, you've got to watch The Mandalorian. It completely redeems Star Wars. And I just can't bring myself to do it. Like The Last Jedi just completely wiped out, because knowing how Luke was always my favorite and knowing how Luke ends, I just don't care anymore.
Right.
Like it just ruined it.
Yeah. Compare that to Rogue One.
Oh, it was awesome.
Oh, Rogue One was
the best.
I love that movie.
That was great.
Love that movie.
And what was the lesson?
Sacrifice.
That many people gave their lives for a
Yep.
Now you can talk about some of the, is duplicity necessary? Are you are you hurting more than you're helping when you're, working for your enemy in that regard? I mean, so there's good questions that you can mine from that film, but the ultimate value is timeless. And it's Christian. So
yeah, it's a great point.
Well, when should we be looking for this book to come out, Lenny?
I gotta hurry up and finish it, don't I? So probably next year.
Cool.
probably next year, but we'll see how we can if we can wrap it up. But it's exciting, and you see things even like I on the problem of evil. I lead off with the line in Batman versus Superman where Lex Luthor is challenging, and he actually throws out a kind of a version of the Euthyphro dilemma, right? And he says, is God, you're a God. Is that, I learned early on that God can't be all good because the evil exists. And it's fascinating. So here's a great philosophical question that we can actually take apart and take a look at it and things like that. So,
yeah.
Well, Lenny, as we start to wrap up here, are there any resources you can point people to online where they can find more? We've talked about your podcast a bit at podcast.comereason.org. And
so everything's Come Reason. And the podcast you can find from the Come Reason website. And I've got a good 1,000 articles online through the blog. And I've got a YouTube channel that I'm slowly adding to. I'm putting together a series, a teaching series on Christianity and science that deals with some of the issues of science today and how Christians need to approach it. And is Christianity and science at loggerheads, or, are they friends, or how do you approach it? And then we go into real specific details with things like for example, this Tuesday, I'm going to be doing the why your mind is not your brain and the existence of the soul and stuff like that. And we'll talk about that.
Cool.
So that's coming up. And then I'm also working on a project where I'm hoping to go in, and I'm working with Ratio Christi on this, to go in and reach the teachers. That's what we're calling, reach the teachers. So if you go into a college or university and, touch some Christians, touch some students for a semester, I think that's great. And I've done that for many years. What I want to do is go in and reach the professor of the classroom and start building them up in a missional mindset. Because if you grab a student, you've got that student. But if you get a professor, you've got his classroom for the next 20 years. And when the kids are hearing something, who are they going to turn to when they're on campus? I'm not there anymore. They're going to go to the guy who has office hours, their prof from another department who they trust, they know is a believer, and they say, hey, you're a smart guy. How do you deal with this? So if we can get some of the professors to be missional in this, I think, and there's a lot of Christians in college campuses, a lot of them are kind of undercover because, it's reputationally damaging maybe, or they just be quiet, keep their head down. They don't want to be mocked. I get that. I understand that. Nobody likes that. But if there's something we can do to bring them out and have them as a resource at the school for the students, I think that's going to be hugely valuable. So that's another piece I'm working on.
Great. Well, Lenny, it's been a real pleasure and great to catch up with you and hear about all you're doing. It continues to make a great impact, so we really appreciate it. And we'll be looking forward to this book and hope to promote it as well when that comes out.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you
Yeah,
guys.
it was nice to meet you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Hey, do you love a good story? Great. Then you got to check out the #Storytime podcast. Each episode brings you the craziest, creepiest, and cringiest stories from YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and beyond.
My story is about the time that I was broken up with at the 9/11 memorial. Twice.
Look, the internet is a dumpster full of stories, and I, your host, Will McFadden, dive in headfirst, sift through the flaming trash, and bring you nothing but treasures. Listen to all 21 episodes of #Storytime now on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
There's never been a better time to switch to Spectrum Mobile. You could save hundreds of dollars on your mobile bill. Plus, there are no added taxes, hidden fees, and no contracts, all on the most reliable service. Click to try the Spectrum Mobile Savings Calculator. In 3 easy steps, you'll see how much you could save with Spectrum Mobile. Visit spectrummobile.com/save today. Spectrum Internet required. Savings may vary. Restrictions apply. Visit spectrummobile.com/save for details.